My name is Randy Kramer. I'm a professor of environmental economics here in the Nicholas School, and I want to welcome you to the environmental issues session on water. The protection of our freshwater resources is critically important to human health and well-being. Not only is access to good quality water a necessity for human life, but water resources also provide a variety of other services, including irrigation, habitat for aquatic resources, transportation, recreation, and industrial cooling. Water is also one of the most highly politicized of our natural resources. So solving our water problems involves a complex set of institutions that play out at the national, regional, local, and even international levels. This session will explore a number of water issues and identify areas where new policy solutions are needed. We have a very distinguished panel with a wealth of experience to lead our discussion. I will briefly introduce our panel. They will then make some opening comments, and then we will open it up for you to ask questions and to make comments. So let me introduce our panel. Seated next to me is Sandra Postel. Sandra is director of the Global Water Policy Project in Amherst, Massachusetts, and a visiting senior lecturer in environmental studies at Mount Holyoke College. From 1988 until 1994, she served as Vice President for Research at the World Watch Institute, an organization she remains affiliated with as Senior Fellow. A leading authority on international water issues, Sandra is author of Pillar of Sand, Can the Irrigation Miracle Last? And of Last Oasis, Facing Water Scarcity. She received her Master's of Environmental Management degree from Duke and was awarded the School of the Environment's Distinguished Alumni Award in 1991. Seated next to her is Ken Reckhow. Ken Reckhow is Professor of Water Resources here in the Nicholas School and is Chairman of the Environmental Sciences and Policy Division. Until recently, he also served as Director of the North Carolina Water Resources Research Institute. Ken's research activities have focused on the development and application of models and other tools for the management of water quality. He has served as President of the National Institutes for Water Resources and Chair of the North Carolina Sedimentation Control Commission. He was recently Chair of the National Academy of Sciences Committee assessing the scientific basis of the EPA TMDL program, a major water quality regulatory framework. Our third panel member is Bill Reilly. He's founding partner of Aqua International Partners.
The lights always go out for me.
Bill is founding partner of Aqua International Partners, a private equity fund which invests in companies engaged in water and renewable energy. He has held an array of national leadership positions related to the environment, including Administrator of the U.S. EPA, President of the World Wildlife Fund, and President of Conservation Foundation. Currently, he's Chairman of the Board of the World Wildlife Fund, Co-Chair of the National Commission on Energy Policy, and as we heard this morning, Chair of the Advisory Board for the Nicholas Institute. Sandra Postel will kick off our panel here.
Thank you, Randy. It is just great to be here. I have to say, as a proud alumni and a longtime environmental analyst, I'm just thrilled to be part of this launch of what I think will be just a fantastic opportunity to integrate the knowledge and incredible work that's going on here into products that are more directly solving problems and developing policies. I think this is just an incredibly exciting moment for all of us to be gathered here, and I'm thrilled to be part of it. We have about 10 minutes, 8 minutes,
yes.
10 minutes,
yes.
Okay. There is no doubt in my mind that one of the biggest challenges we're going to face is figuring out how we're going to meet the water demands of 8 billion, 9 billion people, while at the same time we protect the aquatic ecosystems that we're coming to understand more and more, support our economies, and so much other life around us. Let me just give you a quick sense of the scale of that challenge. If we look just at the water required to meet the diets of the 1.7 billion people that will be added between now and about 2030, we're looking at an amount of water to grow the food to meet those dietary needs at today's average level, no increase in dietary consumption. We're looking at an amount of water equivalent to roughly 24 Nile rivers or 110 Colorado rivers. And so the question is, where's that water going to come from and at what ecological cost? We already have a lot of evidence of depleted rivers, rivers running dry, groundwater tables falling. Something like 10% of our food today is produced through the unsustainable practice of overpumping groundwater. Is groundwater going to be a continued source? Do we clear more forests for rain-fed crop production and try to turn more rain-fed land into productive cropland? All of these have ecological costs. And so I think the question that I've been grappling with, and that I hope we can grapple with a bit, is this: is there a better way to do this? Is there a better way to meet human needs that don't have such damaging effects on ecosystems that are providing valuable services to us? If we think about the water strategies of this past century, the age of dams, the age of big engineering projects, they really worked largely against nature rather than in partnership with it. And I think if we really think about overhauling water management in a way that's going to move us in the direction of meeting that challenge, we're going to have to turn that around and really have policies that have the health of ecosystems at the core and not at the periphery, which is where they've been for most of the last century. For sure, we've had tremendous benefits from the water projects of the last century. More food production through irrigation, more flood control, more hydropower. But the ecological costs have been high, and they're rising. And Katrina is a timely and important reminder of that. So it seems to me we need to have policy solutions, and I think it is a good term, that begin to reorient our water management strategies with ecosystem health at the core, and that take advantage of the ecosystem services that are coming from healthy freshwater ecosystems. Everything from purifying water for drinking, to controlling floods in more natural ways, to recharging groundwater. All these things are being done by natural systems that are now very much under pressure and under assault. The good news, I think, is that there's increasing evidence that capitalizing on natural services, capitalizing on the benefits that healthy ecosystems are providing, can in fact meet societal goals at a lower cost, very often, than the traditional, conventional approaches that we've been accustomed to using to solve these water supply needs. Often one-tenth to one-half the cost of conventional alternatives. So let me mention 3 areas in which I think we're sort of ripe for some interesting policy change and solutions, and where I think the Nicholas Institute could play an important role and make a difference. First, I think developing mechanisms to protect watersheds and wetlands for their water purification services is incredibly important. 2 years out from now, we're going to have a world population that's half urban, and they're going to need drinking water. And so providing safe drinking water, reliable water supplies at an affordable cost for half the human population living in cities is going to be a huge challenge. And healthy watersheds and wetlands are going to be a part of that solution. We now have a handful of good examples around the world of cities that are in fact benefiting from having protected watersheds specifically for this reason. Sometimes inadvertently, it may be in some cases protection of land for their biodiversity value, but they also happen to have very important water supply benefits attached to them. New York City's effort is probably the most widely known, and it's an important one. New York City was, like every city in the United States, having to meet the filtration need, the requirement for filtration if you have surface water supplies, which was a requirement passed by the federal government, unless it can be shown that you have effective watershed management. And New York decided to go the watershed route, investing about $1.5 billion over 10 years in protection of the Catskills-Delaware watershed, and has, as a result of that, avoided the need to build a $6 to $8 billion filtration plant that would also cost $300 million a year to operate. It took a long time to get to that agreement. It's been hard to implement, but it's working, and it's showing that a healthy watershed developed in partnership with the farmers and foresters and communities that are in that location, with a payment for the service of providing that clean water, can create a win-win opportunity for both. And I think it's a really good example. And when I talk to people in the developing world They point to the New York example even more than some other countries in their own neck of the woods, like Costa Rica, which has also developed some interesting approaches here, because the New York watershed is a working watershed. There are farms and forests that are in use. But a partnership approach allowed all the parties to come to the table and say, we can work this out in a way that satisfies everybody. And I think it's a great example. But we have others in this country, Portland, Oregon, Portland, Maine, Seattle, where watershed protection has allowed them to avoid building expensive filtration plants, saving people millions of dollars and protecting the watersheds. In the developing world, Bogota, Colombia is an interesting example. 7 million people, relatively poor city, and they've protected the high elevation wetlands in order to have reliable water supplies and relatively inexpensive water that doesn't need a lot of treatment, little chlorine here and there. And they've coupled that with a conservation program that has allowed them to delay the need to construct new water supply facilities for 20 years. So I think this coupling of watershed protection and serious conservation is a really underattended and underappreciated set of benefits that we can capture more of. I have to say Boston in my backyard is another great example. We hit a 50-year low in water use in Greater Boston last year through an effective conservation program. And that has saved at least $500 million in capital expenditures and indefinitely avoided the need for another diversion from the Connecticut River. Again, we have a few good examples, but by and large, I think we're really failing to capture these benefits. And it's a failure of policy so far to really put watershed protection and conservation firmly in the front. Second thing I want to mention is the need to focus on water productivity in agriculture. And I come at this because agriculture is by far the largest user of water in the world. If we're going to have any hope of meeting that challenge I laid out at the beginning, we've got to probably double water productivity in agriculture. And that involves irrigation efficiency, it involves potentially changes in diets, increased rain-fed productivity, a lot of things. And that's going to be a broad set of policy challenges we're going to have to really grapple with, everything from irrigation subsidies to trade policies and so on. But also on that, and this is something I think I'd love for us to talk a bit more about, is the importance of dealing with hunger and water directly. We currently have 850 million people in the world who are hungry. And it's interesting to me that the vast majority of them live on farms in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia primarily. And the reason they're hungry is they have neither the means to grow the food that they need, even though they're on a farm, nor the income to purchase the food that they need to no longer be hungry. And small amounts of irrigation water are very often the key to getting out of that trap. And the problem with irrigation so far is that technologies have not been designed for the $1-a-day farmer on an acre or two of land. They're too expensive, they're too big, and they're not affordable. But we have a lot of examples now of technologies that have been designed for affordability, that are reaching farmers at the $1-a-day or $2-a-day level, and that are literally helping them get out of that poverty trap. Policies in general have not been promoting that in our development strategies. And I think this is another area where some good work could be done. I saw firsthand in Bangladesh a little technology called the treadle pump, which looks a lot like a Stairmaster exercise machine, you know, helping farmers in the poor parts of Bangladesh. Over 1 million of these have been purchased. I know Bill has worked a lot on low-cost drip irrigation. It's moving really fast in India. I saw some of those also when I was there. And these are dealing with the problem right where it's occurring, allowing small farmers access to technology and water in a way that will alleviate poverty. I'm pretty sure there's no way we're going to meet the global goals of having poverty and hunger by 2015 unless we deal with this issue. The last thing I'd like to mention, I hope I haven't gone over yet, is that I think we need to enlist nature's help in mitigating disasters. And there's no better time to begin working on that now. I think there's a moment in time now that we can use to take advantage of people's interest and concern in what's gone on in this country and begin to craft some solutions that take advantage of that. I think we need, in particular, in a sense, to have policies that are buying us disaster insurance through watershed protection, wetland protection, and floodplain protection. These are three areas we know provide substantial benefits and often pay for themselves in strict economic terms. If you remember, after the Great Midwest Flood in 1993, some research was done that showed that if we had at that time in place 13 million acres in the upper Mississippi watershed in their original wetland landscapes, for a cost of $2 to $3 billion at that time, we would have been able to, in effect, reduce the flood damage tremendously, and that flood damage, as you recall, I think it ranged between 16 to 19 billion in damage. So again, a seemingly cost-effective approach of using the natural water storage functions of wetlands in order to prevent substantially more damage. I just want to end with one thought, and I've been thinking a lot about this myself, and I thought about it more this morning from the very thought-provoking presentations we had this morning. On my vacation this summer, I spent a little time rereading some of Rachel Carson's work, and including some of her speeches. And it was very interesting to me that in one speech she gave, I think she was receiving the John Burroughs Award for her book, The Sea Around Us. And she made the point to her audience that it was very important that the scientific community start believing more strongly that the public is interested in what they do and what they have to say, and that we have to learn to communicate with them and be willing, to communicate with them. And she, of course, was brilliant at this, masterful at this. But it was a challenge to the community of scientists she was addressing to stop talking to each other and writing for each other and begin to engage a much broader public. And I think, I'm hoping that this inauguration of this institute will encourage us to do the same and begin to bring a lot more people under this tent with us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Sandra. And since you didn't plug your latest publication, I will do so. WorldWatch has just released this publication, Liquid Assets, the Critical Need to Safeguard Freshwater Ecosystems.
I do have a few of these here, by the way. So
we'll now turn to our second panel member, Ken Reckhow.
Thanks, Randy. I'd like to begin by echoing Sandra's comments, initial comments, that the Nicholas Institute is going to be an exciting place for us to be working, and I feel particularly adamant about that as a faculty member here for the past 25 years, the opportunities that this will provide us as faculty, our graduate students, as well as visitors who we will interact, who will enrich our education and enrich our research. This is an exciting time for us, and in particular from my perspective, where I am a natural scientist with strong interests in policy sciences, I see the Institute as a perfect merger of those two areas. What I'm going to do is use my few minutes today to talk about recent and current U.S. water quality management policy and some of the key challenges that we face cleaning up our nation's waters. And some of this is going to touch on the natural sciences and some of it on the policy sciences. And it addresses specifically the program that Randy mentioned earlier that I was involved in with the National Academy of Sciences. Since passage of the Clean Water Act in 1972, improvements in U.S. surface water quality have been really significant, largely due to stringent pollutant controls at point sources, both private and public wastewater treatment plants. But despite these improvements, it's been estimated that we have over 20,000 water bodies in the United States that are still in violation of one or more water quality standards. Thus, much remains to be done. Unfortunately, we face or have a situation now where current regulatory approaches, along with key scientific uncertainties, so both the policy area and the natural sciences area, are impeding further progress. With regards to the natural sciences area, in my area of work, the scientific uncertainties inherent in the establishment of so much of the program are an impediment. They're inherent in the establishment of setting the water quality standards to achieve reasonable use. The uncertainties are inherent in the limited water quality sampling to assess compliance or non-compliance with standards. And these uncertainties are inherent in the errors and predictions to assess necessary pollutant load reductions. These uncertainties are important not just simply from an academic standpoint, but they're important for policy development and management decisions because they directly relate to the cost of environmental damage and the cost of pollution control. So today in the United States, the primary regulatory approach for surface water quality protection is called the Total Maximum Daily Load, or TMDL program. The TMDL is the allowable pollutant load to a water body from point and non-point sources that achieves compliance with the applicable water quality standard, and it also is to include a margin of safety, and this margin of safety is to account, or rather to hedge decisions in the direction of extra environmental protection. Unfortunately, implementation of the TMDL program often has occurred with an inflexibility that is inconsistent with the consequences of large uncertainties, the costs of poor decision, and the advancement in scientific knowledge in the past 30 years. The national enthusiasm for environmental protection that surrounded the passage of the Clean Water Act and the establishment of the goal of fishable, swimmable waters resulted in many states adopting water quality standards without a rigorous appraisal of their attainability. Fortunately, flexibility was incorporated in the 1972 Clean Water Act, making the TMDL, or this cornerstone program, part of a continuing planning process. Unfortunately, actual practice thus far has displayed little adjustment and a little adaptability consistent with this permitted flexibility. For example, water quality standard setting was conceived as an adaptive process, building on new knowledge to feed into a required triennial review of standards. In addition, new knowledge was also expected to result in revision and refinement of the designated use through use attainability analysis. In practice, despite the substantial scientific advancements in the past 30 years, standards rarely undergo rigorous site-specific review, and use attainability analysis is rarely undertaken. The result is an inefficient program that is severely hampered by this regulatory inflexibility. As Randy mentioned, in 2001, I chaired a National Academy of Sciences committee which was charged by Congress with assessing the scientific basis of the TMDL program. Made several observations, and they're contained in this book that the National Academy published. And in particular, it was noted, and these are particular points that I want to make with regards to the issues that I'm concerned about here. For example, it said certain designated uses, such as fishable and swimmable designation in highly urbanized areas, did not appear realistically attainable, yet no use attainability analysis was contemplated. And despite advances in scientific knowledge in the past 30 years, water quality criteria, which serve as the measure of standards compliance, have been rarely modified in the triennial reviews. Statistical methods, essential for drawing scientifically rigorous conclusions, were rarely used in sampling design and hypothesis testing for assessing compliance with water quality standards. And finally, water quality models, often used to predict the TMDL, generally have high uncertainties, yet this uncertainty is not often assessed. As a result, the impact of the uncertainty, that is the impact on the cost of environmental damage and the cost of compliance, are rarely considered. But despite the observations of our committee and a call for change, not only from our NRC committee, but widely across the U.S., Congress has been unable to pass a new watershed rule to improve this TMDL program. Why? Well, you'd probably say that both sides, if you look at this as certainly different sides of an issue, are at fault. The principal non-point polluters are concerned that they will be more severely regulated, and so they're hesitant to see anything considered by Congress. Whereas the environmental community is concerned that this will simply be an excuse to weaken the program during the Bush administration. So what can be done now? Our report provided recommendations to address these issues and other issues, and we feel that even under the current watershed rule that we could make substantial advances. Of particular importance, though, we urge that the flexibility implied in the current Section 303 of the Clean Water Act of 1972 become a cornerstone of the TMDL program through the process of adaptive management. In essence, we recommended that TMDLs be implemented in an adaptive manner so that learning while doing occurred, permitting improvements to be undertaken based on a revision and improvement of knowledge. Of course, for a flexible strategy like that to work effectively, we need reliable scientific information. That is, we need to minimize the errors associated with misdiagnosis of water quality impairment. For example, consider that medical treatment is most efficient for the general population when only the sick are treated. Thus, minimizing the errors of incorrect diagnosis is central to the most effective use of resources to maintain a healthy population. Correct diagnosis is also critical for efficient use of the limited resources for water quality improvements. We need to guide the states on appropriate sampling design and statistical hypothesis testing to minimize the errors of compliance and non-compliance designations, and thus minimize the costs associated with these erroneous designations. As a final point with regards to these recommendations, I want to emphasize that I view these recommendations as a call for action and not as a recipe for delay pending further study, which the adaptive approach has been accused of being. The flexibility permitted in the Clean Water Act will allow science and policy-based decisions that address attainable standards with pollutant load controls to move in the right direction towards water quality improvements. TMDL modeling and forecasting under uncertainty, augmented by post-implementation monitoring, will result in refinements in water quality management strategies and improve water quality forecasting and models over time. So I'm confident that this adaptive strategy involving both the natural sciences and the policy sciences can move us substantially closer toward a major cleanup of our nation's waters. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Bill?
Thank you. I kept looking for the silver lining, Ken, as you were describing the TMDL program. I'm reminded of my predecessor as EPA Administrator, Bill Ruckelshaus, who once had to deal with some disappointments in achieving fishable and swimmable waters, reporting on the progress of the Clean Water Act. And he said, well, they may not all be fishable and swimmable, but at least they're no longer flammable. You know, so we can say they're directionally correct. Huh?
That's right. That's right.
I was very intrigued to listen to you, Sandra, compliment what has happened in New York. The decision to allow New York to try to regulate and protect its watershed as a way to obviate the need to put several $billion into new wastewater treatment, drinking water purification, actually, in New York City was a hugely controversial one. And the Assistant Administrator for Water, Luana Wiltshire, and her staff were adamant that surface water protection would never work in New York. The localities wouldn't agree to it. The development rate was too great. There was already fecal coliform and giardia in the watershed. The regional administrator in New York said, let's at least give it a try. The New York staff said, you know, this is coming at a terrible time for the economy of New York. We have not in the United States ever given it a serious attempt to try. And I came down on that side of it. But I have to say, I didn't really expect over the long term it would be as effective as it has. I thought I was buying time. I didn't think I was resolving the problem.
I think the verdict is still out. I mean, it's still a new program. It may be buying time.
Well, to hear somebody like you praise it, though, is they must be doing something right. I'm not going to talk about the U.S., though. I'm going to talk mostly about the developing world. In my capacity as head of delegation of the United States delegation at Rio, at the UN conference, where we addressed issues of biological diversity, climate change, and upper atmosphere ozone protection, there were at least 5 ministers from developing countries who took it upon themselves to have private conversations with me and said almost the same thing. I don't think it was an organized effort, but they said, you know, it's great that you are concerned about some of these issues, and without denigrating the scientific significance of some of them, which we accept, they really do not touch on the lives and deaths of the people of our country. And I remember the ministers from India, Kamal Nath, and Nigeria, Mexico, Colosio was the minister there then, a couple of other countries, made variants of that complaint. And I said, what then would you consider more serious that we address? And they said, every one of them, water. People are dying in our countries. The hospitals of our countries are full of people who have been affected by diseases, waterborne diseases. Many more people lie in hospitals for waterborne disease-related problems and are dying from those problems than the combined malaria, AIDS, and tuberculosis. It is a hugely important problem, and it likely will get worse in many parts of the world. And it occurred to me to change the presentation in the United States that we were going to, in fact, I did change it, and then I was persuaded by one member of my delegation to change it back because the President was coming and we were going to do a press conference, and the question was going to arise, okay, what are you actually going to do about this? And there was no more money around, and the only thing we knew to do was to put AID resources, which we didn't have a lot of, behind some of these problems. Not long after that, however, there appeared in the developing world, largely at the instance of the World Bank, a new friendliness, a new support for involving private capital in addressing some of these problems. And it was on the basis of that welcoming new mood, and it was a conversion for the development economists. Development economists had historically said that the takeoff in developing countries is about telecommunications, communications, power, and roads. Those are the things you need. Water is nice to have, but it's essentially a middle-class enthusiasm. It can come later. They changed. In the 1990s, the philosophy began to emerge that for two reasons, water deserved a much higher priority. One reason was a straightforward development one. In the OECD countries, something like 45% of our water goes to industry. In the developing countries, it's more like 15 or 16%. I think that's the number that I've seen for Latin America. If you want to manufacture automobiles or produce reams of paper or do almost any kind of construction, refining, and the rest, you need vast amounts of water, and you can't get them, as Sandra said, by finding more opportunities to dam up rivers and to create reservoirs. You will do more harm than good. You will find that you won't get financing from any bank that follows the Equator Principles, and the multinational aid and lending institutions won't want to do it either. So you've got to get that water somewhere. We had a six-fold increase in water use over the last century, at the same time as population doubled. And you see that's the trend. We are now probably withdrawing significantly more water than is being replenished naturally. So we have all the makings of a very severe water problem, if not a crisis, in many parts of the world. However, one of the reasons that we were able to go into this business, and over the last 5 years we've deployed about $250 million in for-profit investments in 7 countries, was because the efficiencies are there. You can get them. You can get them in drip irrigation, which we've been doing, as Sandra mentioned, in India. In drip irrigation, you get you reduce the use of water by at least 50%, and you typically increase the output of the crops by more than 2 times. And this has been hugely effective in India. We actually serve in our business there, which we just sold last week, the small farmers, the farmers of 2 and 3 hectares. The big farmers typically can afford pumps, and they're now producing water from 350 feet down. They're taking the groundwater, and it's dropping about 10 to 12 feet a year in Maharashtra and other states of India. They're taking that water to irrigate lentils, a relatively low-value crop, which is really a disaster. Why are they doing it? Because their electricity is subsidized by their government. So one of the first tasks I think we have, and I hope the World Water Forum in Mexico City pays attention to this, is to try to get some recognition that the counterproductive subsidies for free electricity for farmers, which is also true in Mexico and any number of other countries, has simply got to stop. These are doing very serious damage to the ecology, and they're going finally to deplete fundamentally, vitally important groundwater. The Nicholas Institute and the Aspen Institute sponsored recently a report, and Ken just suggested maybe the margins for profit are too low on it because nobody bothered to stock it out there. It's the newest such thing to come out. You got it. I was looking for one. A silent tsunami. This was something that was chaired by Hattie Babbitt and myself. Hattie Babbitt was the former ambassador to the Organization of American States and Deputy Administrator of AID. We we looked at some recommendations, and this was really put together at the request of some Mexicans in order to help the Mexicans get ready for the World Water Forum. The Mexicans did something that's really quite classic, and some of my friends had a lot to do with this, NGOs in Mexico. They, the NGO folks appealed to the ego of the government. Wouldn't you like to get the World Water Forum? It's thousands of people, a lot of people come to the country, pay attention to your country, and everybody said, yes, it's a terrific idea, it's wonderful. And only later, after they had competed for it and won it, did they realize the entire focus of people like Sandra Postel and others who care about efficient use of water is going to be focused on one country. And they may actually have to do something about the fact that they only treat less than 4% of their wastewater in an arid country, which is calamitously wasteful. Well, so we tried to give them some recommendations about things they might pay attention to and things that might not otherwise have come to the attention of the World Water Forum and to Mexico itself. And made some recommendations. And one of the discoveries we made, there were 30 of us who met for 3 days, was that NGOs are doing some very good things, and probably not so well understood. Water for People is the not-for-profit arm of the American Water Works Association, represents water utilities. They're more than a decade old, not much more. They have projects in 450 communities. They're doing the kind of things that in my kind of business you couldn't do, dealing with the most egregious problems in the most bereft areas. Living Water International, likewise, is a faith-based organization, draws on volunteer engineers, geologists, construction managers, educators. They do just very basic infrastructure for needy, small, impecunious villages and towns. CARE has worked in the water sector for about 50 years. It's helped, they say, some 20 million people in 40 countries, places like Bangladesh, El Salvador, Jordan, the West Bank. And some of the in the non-governmental sector, some of the companies, I think, are making very important contributions. Procter & Gamble, in partnership with USAID, has produced Pure, P-U-R, a sachet of simple chemicals that's the equivalent of a little wastewater treatment plant in a small packet. And these have been marvelously effective after disasters, after contamination of water. They settle out pathogens and heavy metals, and they cause the user of the water to actually see the opacity decline as these products do their good work. Anyway, Coca-Cola has been very active. They've been actually challenged in India and other places for taking excessive groundwater from the areas, and 2 of their places have actually been invaded by angry people, angry farmers. The farmers themselves are the guilty parties of taking that groundwater, but Coca-Cola, of course, is more visible and obvious. At any rate, just to, in the minute or 2 remaining, the principal recommendations that we make in this report: all schools and orphanages should have clean water, sanitation, and hygiene education by 2015. This is something I think governments can get behind. This captured everyone's imagination among our group. UNICEF estimates that half the schools in the world do not have clean water and basic sanitation. This, they say, hits girls particularly hard, reducing their chance for education. And groups report anecdotal evidence that water and sanitation actually improve attendance. For reasons of health, the economy, and environmental sustainability, governments really have to invest more in water infrastructure. I think in addition to focusing on the governments to stop the subsidies that are counterproductive, we've also got to recognize the extreme inefficiency of the typical public water and sanitation agency in the developing world. Wastage levels of 50, 60, 70% are not uncommon. Featherbedding, way overstaffing at 10 times more than you would have for an equivalent OECD public water body. A lot of cheating, a lot of people who are excused from paying their bills because they pay the bill collector for these entities. This stuff is really very serious, and while a lot of the nonprofit sector has been focused on trying to stop privatization and what has been seen as the exploitation of people in poor countries by private companies, not many people want to invest in privatization anymore in water in the developing world. It's time really to make the public bodies work, to make them more effective, and I hope that gets a lot of attention at the World Water Congress. Because water and sanitation are the responsibility of women in much of the developing world. They should become more directly involved in managing water resources and making water-related decisions. Packard Foundation has been very encouraging. I serve on that board. Has been very encouraging to women in Pakistan and Ethiopia and other countries with respect to a whole range of issues, and learned just last week that 80% of the medical students in Pakistan are women. The boys are going to madrasas, apparently, and the girls are studying science. So, and there haven't been very many female doctors historically in Pakistan, so this is marvelous. Development assistance should emphasize building local capacity and creating legal frameworks for managing water and building local sources of funding. I think that the opportunity to improve water use is suggested by one statistic that somewhere deep in my background I recall that one could take one of our western states and reduce by 10% the amount of water used for irrigation in agriculture, which would free up 100% increase in the water available for urban use. That's the disproportion that Sandra was talking about how much water is used by agriculture. So the opportunities to improve this, the way we deal with these issues, this resource, are out there, and there are reasons to think that we could make a lot of progress, but we had better, for reasons of health, for productivity, and for our livelihoods. I was so taken recently by the fascination that people had about the probe of Mars. Some of you may remember, and you may remember the cause of the fascination. The question that was posed, is there or isn't there water? Any evidence of water? Why is that so important? Well, water is life. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to pose the first question, and then others can join in as well. And I'm going to direct this question to Bill, because many of the issues that you raised are within the realm of UN agencies like UNICEF, UNDP, UNEP, World Bank, and so forth. Have you thought about how the Nicholas Institute might be effective in either influencing or collaborating with UN agencies?
Well, I think that the first opportunity we will have, and we've laid a little bit of a case for this, and the Mexicans are aware that we've done it for them, is to work with the World Water Congress to try to focus on some of these issues. It would be very helpful if we could direct attention to, in my view, to some of the very serious issues of water delivery and water efficiency in some of the countries. I would hope we would make a priority of doing that in Mexico, where water is not well managed. It's an arid country that's growing very rapidly and that has a very bad history of dealing with water. I think that were we to do that, certainly if under the current government, I think we'd be welcome. The Water Commission there is, I think, somewhat responsive to proposals for imaginative interventions. I would myself tend to see more opportunities dealing with a government like Mexico, although that could all change under the next president, than working with some of the UN agencies, at least at this time. But it depends on which country you're looking at and who has a on-the-ground presence, I think.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's now open it up, and if you would please state your name.
Hi, I'm Miguel Medina with the Pratt School of Engineering, therefore I feel like I should defend engineers a little bit. Sandra made some comments about the fact that engineering had not necessarily been done in concert with nature, but engineers don't set policy. And basically engineers analyze, design, look at alternative solutions, and in many cases the policy is set by others than engineers. One example of the fact that when engineers talk not everybody listens is the disaster in New Orleans. There were extremely accurate computer simulations of the disaster that was going to occur if a Category 4 or 5 hurricane ever hit New Orleans, years before the event actually happened. And the numbers are the predictions of 20 feet of water and the locations and the levees that would break were completely accurate. And this was just simply ignored. I think it was a no-win situation to try to engineer a solution in New Orleans to not only the the flooding, but the water quality problems that are going to come after that. With regard to some of Ken's comments, I think regulators do not like uncertainty, unfortunately, because there are water quality models, as you're well aware, that can account for uncertainty. But I have always felt that when you read the laws, they're generally statements like the Water Quality Act of 1972 that said there shall be zero discharge by the year so-and-so. It was one of those statements that no engineer scientist would ever agree with. So I think there's a general reticence to look at a law that accounts for uncertainty. And my last comment for Bill Reilly, I've studied Mexico's environmental protection laws. They're quite strict. They're simply not enforced.
Years ago, I had a researcher in Mexico who's doing some work for me at the Conservation Foundation, and his first report back was he'd spent 3 months reading all the statutes and informing himself of the laws, and he said, I think I just wasted 3 months. He said, Mexico is the country of the arrangement, he said. I thought it was nicely put. He said, now I've begun to find out how things really work, and I think I could be effective if I figured that out.
And let me just say one last thing. The word water quality in Mexico is dynamite. You can talk about water quantity, you can talk about insufficiency of water, they don't mind that. The minute you mention the word water quality and meeting water quality, it's really a very touchy subject.
Miguel, I'd like to address the point you directed towards me with regards to regulators and their aversion to dealing with uncertainty, and I agree with you. And it's ironic, of course, because you talked about Hurricane Katrina, and we're now facing another hurricane that is, as you know, is affecting Texas and Houston. And the way I view that as a natural scientist is that I am informing the public and decision makers more thoroughly by, instead of saying, here is the trajectory and making it simply a line on the map, is that I show zones, color-coded zones in the case of hurricanes, and that allows a town manager, a mayor, a federal government, the state government, at least in principle, to take into consideration the solidness or the adequacy of the scientific knowledge, as well as their utility function or their attitude toward risk, and I believe make better decisions. And that's what I'm talking about with regards to water quality.
What I would like to just say is, of course, the computer models were extremely good. If you look at the path of Katrina, you have to say that to the people in the Hurricane Center, they got it within 50 miles. And I think you will see that Rita will hit more or less where it's predicted. It's amazingly good technology.
Just one final comment on that. As you know, some models are better than others, and sadly, our water quality models don't match up.
I think Sandra wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, just one. I certainly wasn't, sort of chastising. Some of my best friends are engineers, believe me. But I think, of course, it's public policy that's driving what we do. I think the point I'm trying to make is that if we're going to have ecosystem health more at the center of our water management practices, we're going to have to open up the decision-making and the action to not only engineers and hydrologists whose domain it's primarily been so far, but also to ecologists and foresters and soil scientists and anthropologists and others whose wisdom has to be brought to bear on this this set of questions. So I think it's really an opening to a broader look at what water management is and defining it in ways that are not entirely structural and not entirely to be done by engineers. That's the main point.
Several of us have secondary appointments with Nicholas.
Julie.
I have a question on solutions and values. There's an AP article written over the weekend, and it's about the San Joaquin River Valley. And there you've got, from the time back to John Muir, you've got some conservation issues, you've got agriculture issues, you've got development issues coming out of San Francisco, and you also have the salmon. How on earth, the salmon runs on the San Joaquin River aren't able to run anymore. So how do you take all those conflicting values and find a solution out of that? It's all based on water.
Ken has the answer to that.
Oh, of course. Well, yeah, it's interesting because speaking as an academic, that would be a fascinating problem to bring into my decision analysis class. and look at the utility functions or the value functions of the different interest groups and the different people with a stake in the problem, and identify where there was a commonality of views and where the differences were, and probably end up developing a working group with stakeholders that is guided by this analysis. I could see the Nicholas Institute being engaged in undertaking more of first of all, a scientific analysis of the issue, secondarily, a decision analysis that brought in the natural sciences as well as the values or utility functions, and then ultimately bringing the people together in stakeholder type meetings. But that academic view may be different from, say, an EPA view.
You're handing it back to me.
Yes, I am.
You know, some very good work has been done to try to reconcile some of those interests. And the fact is, water's been over-allocated, and it's certainly, to the ecological uses, to the fisheries and the rest, way under-allocated. So that's the problem that we have to correct. Every time there is a crisis in water in California, we get more interesting economic proposals to pay the farmers not to plant the rice and cultivate all of the crops which are water intensive in the desert. And they're perfectly happy to do that. And then proposals to actually line the ditches that bring the water to the cities to make sure you get as much as you can. That's a proposition that pays for everybody. It may not pay for some of the communities you leave behind that no longer are functioning agricultural communities. And Senator Feinstein intervened recently to prevent one of those transactions on that very ground, that you can't dry up this long-standing, functioning agricultural environment. Those are hard questions, but California's going to have to face them. The Endangered Species Act requires that you face them, and the three major sources of water for Los Angeles are now all under court control. Federal judges have taken responsibility from the administrators for those water systems. And the problem is just to downsize the excessive water take that California has had, more than it was agreed to in the compact, from the other states. Nevada is growing so fast, and they're beginning to take their own. I think, though, that those models of essentially finding some economic rationale for diminishing the very inappropriate, I mean, easy for me to say here, and I'm not running for office in California, uses of a desert environment to produce rice, for example. That's where ultimately we have to go. The best explanation of that was a book written years ago called Cadillac Desert, that I would recommend to you.
The valley there is probably one of the most, I mean, climate-wise, it's where we get our fruit, it's where we, and the development pressures for economic reasons are just incredible.
Sure.
Because people are starting to cross over the mountain range, for land prices, like into Tracy and those areas, just to commute into San Francisco.
American Farmland Trust has done a study showing that Modesto and many of the cities, towns in the heart of the agricultural area are going to lose a very substantial amount of their most fertile farmland, not for water-related reasons, but just for urbanization that's taking up that area. And
Bill, I just wanted to comment. I worked for Secretary Bruce Babbitt when he was negotiating with the state of California on the Bay Delta Accords, which of course involved the San Joaquin Watershed as well. So I would recommend you look at that history. It's very complicated, it's a long time. Essentially the problem was that it was underfunded over the long period. It just has not gotten the money, even at the end of the Clinton administration, but certainly in the Bush administration. Curiously enough, Florida and the Everglades have gotten a little more money. So that's been a principal change. In the late 90s, California was getting more money than Florida, and now Florida's getting more money than California.
Let's take a question from the back of the room here.
Bill, I'm glad you brought up the pure packets.
Sorry.
I just want to mention that I met in London with Procter & Gamble people who produced this pure product and actually took 10,000 of those packets to Iraq. But my question really relates to the fact that I saw them in the field, they were fantastic. They could be distributed in the U.S. for like emergencies like Katrina, they could be then distributed in Iraq. Procter & Gamble told our group that in fact over 1 million of those packets were actually in Mount New York, purchased by the UN, but it was bureaucratic fights between various agencies, both U.S. and UN, and also in the U.S. that actually stopped. In fact, thinking about going out of business with this, even though it's only 3 cents a pack, because they said, we don't want private business making a profit on this, even though they would only make a quarter of a penny per packet. So there's a million packets that sat there with people dying in Iraq and are not being distributed to the U.S. I just wonder what policy changes we made if something good comes like this but can't be used.
Yeah, there is ideological resistance to the private sector solving some of these problems. And I guess it comes from a fear that if that happens, you will not get adequate public responses, and somehow the funds or attention won't flow to the public entities that need to. I think that's very misguided, because in most of the places where this is really useful, there's no competition. In fact, much of my business has been supplanting government in places where you can't begin to drink the water, like Tajikistan. And so we produced basically a new bottled water company that now has 60% market share in that country. And the deputy administrative AID told me that when she goes there, she gets these 5-gallon bottles from our company and pours them into the bathtub, won't even take a bath in public water. I mean, it's that bad in many places. Procter & Gamble, I think the economics are something like they charge 2 or 3 cents, and it's sold typically for 10 on the streets in Delhi and other places.
They would sell it for 2 to 3 cents.
I think
penny in each packet. But the argument that was being used was these are only a temporary solution. When I was in Jordan, they said, well, we could send $1 million in, we could keep people going for 2 weeks or a month or 3. But it's not a permanent solution, so why do it?
Yeah, well, I really don't agree with that at all.
I don't either.
Procter & Gamble gave its first filling grant to a new organization to try to develop a local distribution model and then be replicated. So it's local people developing the product, distributing it, continuing education and so forth to try to make this a viable proposition, because they've decided they cannot make a business venture out of it.
I've been given the signal that we need to wrap this up, so I want to thank the panel for a very thoughtful and thought-provoking